Hi, welcome to History 2321. This is World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, today we're starting session 2 of the first topic of the semester, titled Out of Africa, from the Origins of Humanity and Early Human Societies to the Rise of Civilizations. Now, just to recap rather quickly what we covered in session 1, we looked at in the general introduction, exploring the reasons why looking at prehistory is significant for studying civilizations. And as I mentioned again, it is really the accumulation of knowledge and experience and memory of human beings living in the natural world that enable them at some point to start building again cities. We looked at also sources, what kind of sources we use to study prehistory and civilizations, and we looked at things like, for example, the archaeological record, fossils, remains of all kinds, buildings, structures, and so on, that enabled us to reconstruct the past. We're looking at mythology, symbols, the human beings left in the past in the form of paintings, inscriptions on caves or murals and temples and so on. That also enabled us to understand their worldview, religious, scientific worldviews, and psychological states as well, and also linguistics, how linguistics is used, again, also to track, if you will, the connection between different peoples across time and space, by looking at dialects and language that are related to one another. So those are the sources. Also, we looked at the significance of Africa, why Africa is significant for studying the origins of human beings, and that is because that's the cradle of humanity. And as we'll see in this section, the human beings that actually, in this case, the Homo sapiens, that stepped out of Africa to populate the world, they took many of their ideas that we're going to be exploring today, whether those were political, religious, and social, and so on, and pretty much spread them across the world. Now, in part 2, we also looked at the origins of the universe, exploring some of the theories, the first Big Bang, and then later on the biological Big Bang that occurred in the planet with the emergence of the very first living organisms or cells that created all kinds of lives in the planet. We also looked at the emergence of the first humanoids in Africa about 7 million years ago, and looked at some of the different kinds of humanoids that inhabited that continent, eventually leading to the Homo erectus, the Neanderthals that stepped out of Africa. And later on, much later, about 200,000 years ago or so, we're looking at the Homo sapiens, the modern human being that also stepped out of Africa to populate the world. Now, what we're going to be now covering in part 2, if we can go to our slide here, is early human societies. Now we're going to see the formation, the actual formation of human societies. Roughly speaking, beginning about a 250,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, all the way to the rise, the rise of civilizations. Of course, part 3 is going to deal with the actual rise of civilizations, of course, but prior to the rise of civilizations, there was this period, this long period of time of incubation, if you will, incubation of ideas and knowledge, tool making, and so on, that took about 250,000 years, more or less, to form before human beings entered the stage of civilized life. So again, this is going to be a long process of accumulating knowledge that we're going to be exploring here, in that human beings are beginning to craft the very first societies. They're coming together, in other words, forming communities, and creating the very first social structures, political systems, if we can call them that, and of course the religious beliefs and practices as well. All of that is going to serve as the basis, as we'll see, for civilization. So it is very difficult to understand civilizations without looking at early human societies, because this is the formation of that, in other words, the very early formation. All right. So now in covering part 2, the early human societies, we're going to look at two main historical periods. We can actually subdivide the rise of early human societies into two main epochs or eras. In this case, they're generally speaking called the Stone Age. In very general terms, those two eras are called the Stone Age, but there was, on one hand, a very early Stone Age called the Paleolithic Stone Age, the Paleolithic era. This is the so-called the Old Stone Age, okay, the Old Stone Age. And as we'll see, the second part of the Stone Age will be a sort of Neolithic or New Stone Age, if you will. Okay, there's going to be really a transformation, a transition stage within the Stone Age from the old to the new. So we're going to start with the Paleolithic era or epoch, the so-called the Old Stone Age, that spanned, roughly speaking, from 250,000 BC all the way to 10,000 BC. And one of the reasons that this is called the Stone Age is because Homo sapiens, we're talking now about Homo sapiens now, the modern human, in other words, that surfaces in the continent of Africa, particularly in East Africa, Northeast Africa, began to really craft their tools from stone, very sophisticated, let us just say, kind of stone tools compared to the tools that earlier humanoids actually crafted. They were very limited, tool making, if you will, activities or knowledge taking place before this time, as we explored in part 1. But here, we're going to see now human beings now crafting really the very, very first tools that enable them to survive in the environment. This is very important. Why human beings craft tools is because there is a challenge, and the challenge, of course, that human beings always face, even to this very present day, of course, is survival. Survival in the natural environment in terms of, for example, food collection or hunting, for example. If we are to survive as human beings, we need to produce food, and tools enable human beings to actually produce food or collect it or hunt animals or fish and so on and so forth. So all of the tools that human beings crafted were primarily crafted out of stones, and some out of wood, of course. This is going to be, of course, much, much later. In the very beginning of the Old Stone Age is just, again, stone. But also, it's called the Stone Age because the dwelling places of human beings, the shelter, if you will, the shelters or the locations where human beings actually protected themselves from the natural environment and from animals, from wild animals, were caves as well, and they use caves as residences as well. So this is one of the reasons why this is also called the Stone Age. But what's significant here is that this time when Homo sapiens, modern humans, in other words, back in this time, our human ancestors, they're now enabled with, again, this is a species that now possesses the frontal lobe, as we discussed, which enables humans to analyze natural phenomenon, analyze their own existence, and so on. It enables humans to actually form logical conclusions and so on. What we might just call, scientific reasoning, if you will. Now, of course, during this time, we're not really talking about the kind of scientific reasoning that we are today commonly familiar with. When we go to school and engage in rational analysis and so on, using mathematics and using physics and so on, all of that. No, but they're beginning to use this added faculty, if you will, this intellectual tool, the faculty of the intellect, in other words, to reason, to understand, and also use that ability to start really molding some elements of nature. So when human beings develop, again, the intelligence to start molding some of the elements of nature, such as, for example, rocks. Human beings are actually taking rocks, molding them to suit a certain purpose, to use those tools for hunting or fishing, etc., or for warfare and so on. This is what it's called the beginning of culture. Now, human beings are beginning to form a culture of their own whenever they enter this phase, again, of crafting tools. This is the beginning of what's called technology, in other words, and using those technologies to have a little bit more influence, if you will, over nature. Okay? Influence over nature. In the past, prior to this time, human beings were completely at the mercy of nature. Completely. They were, subject and even vulnerable to the elements, to fire, to cold, the natural calamities of tornadoes and hurricanes, whirlwinds, and so on, and also the animals as well. Human beings were in a state of nature, so to speak, and also very, very vulnerable and very, very fragile on the face of nature because they did not have any tools, any technologies. So human beings, again, or humanoids prior to this time, had an enormous difficulty actually surviving in the environment. Life was rather uncertain, and survival rate was very, very, of course, also very, very limited. So there were no cultures in the past. Human beings were just chasing wild game, trying to battle with animals, sometimes dying in the process. And in many cases, they were eating the flesh of the animals pretty much in the raw state as well. Okay, so there was very little opportunity to develop a culture that involves, for example, tool making, or involves language, or involves creating some form of society that will have some form of organization and so on. It was very difficult. But now we're going to see, the beginning of culture. And culture, to be more precise in our definition, is everything that human beings create that is apart from nature. In other words, there is the world of nature. Nature has forces, has elements, has cycles that function on their own, if you will. And human beings in the past were just trying to survive in that natural state, if you will. But now human beings are going to create certain tools to have some influence over nature, kill more animals, fish, more productively, engage in warfare, if you will, when societies competed over territories and so on, trying to create, of course, systems of knowledge that enable them to come together, cooperate, and create the very first communities, the very first societies. And they're creating a culture, in other words. This is an artificial, if you will, world that human beings create out of experience. All their knowledge, all of their experience is going to actually be applied in the creation of tools and the creation of communities, what we call culture. Okay, so there's the realm of nature, there's the realm of culture, and the realm of culture is everything that human beings make. Whether we're talking about tools, whether we're talking about political systems or religious systems, a society, an economy, etc., art, science, language, all of that is called culture because it's human made. In other words, it's made by humans. In other words, it's crafted by humans. So this is considered the second transformative event in world history. The first transformative event, as we already saw in part one, sorry, was the emergence of life. When life originated on the planet, we talked about that in part one, the very first living organisms, the very first cells that reproduce themselves to create all kinds of living organisms. It was a transformative event because prior to that time, there was no life on Earth. So life appeared. Now, life continued to evolve, so to speak, for millions, eventually billions of years, to the point that Homo sapiens appear, and they exhibit, of course, the capacity to reason now, to formulate ideas, and to understand why things happen in the world, and they create now culture. And remember, culture is an attempt for humans not only to survive in the world of nature, but have some form of influence and control over nature. That is the idea of a culture, to have some form of influence, some form of power over nature. Of course, to what extent we human beings can have power over nature, that's really something that can be debated for many days. But nonetheless, that is what culture is, just an attempt to try to exert some form of influence over nature. So humans have to come together, organize, cooperate, create tools to have that kind of influence. So this is a second transformative event, the beginning of culture. Okay. Now, the culture of the old Stone Age as the culture of the new Stone Age that we're going to be looking at, of course, boiled down to food gathering. Okay. Food is of utmost importance for human beings. Without food, of course, there's no human existence. And now, what human beings are doing is they're coming together to form some kind of society. In the very beginning, as we'll see, those societies were rather small and very, very simple, if you will. But the idea is that people are now coming together, they're cooperating with one another in order to gather food. Okay, first and foremost. Again, this is extremely, extremely important. And as we'll see, this will continue to be pretty much the heart and soul of the cultures of the civilization that we're going to explore. Food production. Okay, food production will continue, will remain the crucial goal for human societies, whether they were small or complex, such as a civilization anyway. So very early on, the culture of the food gatherers were centered on mainly two strategies, two survival strategies. And one was called hunting, the other one was called gathering. Hunting, where they call hunters and gatherers. Okay. There was a division of labor during this time, in that men performed the hunting and women the gathering. Okay. It was a sort of innate, if you will, impulse for human beings to divide their labor in that fashion. There was a general gender division, if you will, of labor, men performing the hunting, women, of course, and children, and those that reached the old age, the elders, were engaged in gathering. Okay, gathering edible plants, gathering fruits or seeds, and so on, out of the wild, in other words. So again, this is not really planting anything, they're just gathering, in other words, collecting, in other words, foodstuffs. The man will engage in the hunting of the animals, and at one point during the day, both of them will meet in a certain place and will pretty much share, of course, the food in order to survive. Okay, so very, very early on, what we see is a culture arising. The very first human societies are on the rise. They're coming together for the purpose of survival, food gathering, and this is again those two strategies that they're actually carrying out. Now, this beginning of culture, as I mentioned, gave birth to new technologies, new tools. In other words, when people come together and they cooperate with one another in order to help each other survive, well, what often happens is that there's going to be a lot of sharing of knowledge and ideas. There will be some individuals that are going to spend some time, of course, thinking about how to survive better, how to improve our survivability in the environment, in other words. Improving tools, for example, and some of them were very creative, very crafty. As we'll see, of course, those individuals much, much later will become the artisans. Right now, there are no actual groupings that we can identify at this time that we can actually call some people, for example, artisans, but there are some people that are very crafty. They spend time thinking, and we're going to see, for example, the use of fire becoming more and more sophisticated and more widespread. This enabled human beings, once again, to step out of certain places, caves and so on, and actually explore the world around them, fight off animals, for example, and as I mentioned, cooking, of course, the meat of the animals as well. This is going to be fundamental, of course, providing heat for themselves at night. So they're going to spend, of course, countless nights, of course, coming together and socializing and bonding as well. Okay. There are other kinds of tools that emerged during this Paleolithic era, the Old Stone Age. Tools that also enable humans to produce more food. And here we're going to see the rise of the fish hook, for example, for fishing. Again, human beings are now becoming very, very sophisticated in the way that they're actually producing food. The spear, for example, is another tool for hunting. The bow and arrow is highly sophisticated. Again, just to be thinking about, again, a weapon, again, to be used to hunt, for example, deer or other animals, in this fashion. Again, it exhibits, of course, now the use of the higher mental capacities in this case. Knives and the throwing stick. So again, there are new tools that were completely unavailable in the past. They're now coming to the rise. Once again, this is the beginning of culture. There is a culture on the rise, and it's a culture centered on food gathering. So all of the technologies are pretty much geared towards increasing the gathering, if you will, of food. Now, in terms of the social organization, I talked about how human beings are coming together and they're cooperating with one another and forming the very first early societies. So in the Paleolithic era, human societies were very, very simplistic. And don't think that they're forming sedentary communities or villages. I mean, not yet. We're not yet in that stage. Here, human beings are moving from place to place. They have a nomadic existence. They're nomads, in other words. Nomads are simply people that constantly move from place to place searching for food, and very often, more often than not, I will say, they're actually moving along certain migrations of animals. They depend upon the hunting of a certain animal that migrates from place to place, and they're just following the food supply. They're nomads. So again, this is a culture based on significant movement. So therefore, the kind of society that was formed during this time was something called a band. Human beings actually came together and joined a band, so to speak. Okay. In many cases, the people that conformed the band, and bands were rather small, they constituted anywhere between 20 and 50 people. Those are just, again, the kind of group that existed, the kind of society that existed during this time. Rather small. Again, it's a band. More often than not, the members were related to one another in familial connections. This was like an extended family, if you will. Now, of course, from time to time, there will be people from other bands that will join a band different from their own. That often happened, and they were adopted and they suddenly merge into this new group, if you will. So again, it was not strictly, again, an extended family per se, but the basis of that society was that it was, of course, at the very core, it was a family, if you will, and other people will join in later on. People during this time were moving from place to place, helping each other survive in the environment, cooperating with one another, gathering, edible foods and hunting, fishing, and of course, because they were very unstable in that they were moving from place to place, there was no way they could actually remain in one spot for a prolonged period of time in order to create a stable society. Okay, so because those were mobile groups that were very unstable, there were no institutions. There were no political institutions or even economic institutions to determine who was the leader, who is the ruler, who is in charge, who's the boss, and so on, who's making decisions for everybody else. So what that means is that because there's no leaders, everybody had an equal participation and an equal status, an equal voice in the band. Those are called egalitarian societies. Egalitarian societies is where everybody is just equal. There's no boss, there's no leader, there's no ruler of any kind, not at this time. Okay? Not only politically, is there's an absence of leadership, and everybody counts, everybody, has exactly the same rights and power, if you will. But also economically, there are no individuals or members of the group that appear to have more than others. We just mentioned a moment ago that there's a gender division of labor. Okay, men and women are performing equally certain functions that are crucial for the survival of the band. Both are equal then. Okay, so men and women are totally, completely equal during this time because both are providers. In other words, both are providing, both are helping the band, and both are seen on an equal footing, if you will, just because, again, there is this egalitarian society that has no structures, no leadership. Everybody is really working for the welfare of the group. Everybody is actually helping out in some way or another. So everybody is important. Everybody counts, in other words. So there's a gender division of labor that provides this equal, if you will, or egalitarian status for men and women. At the same time, there is economic equality here because there is absolutely no private property, not yet. Private property will emerge much later. Once we see the rise of civilizations, some civilizations are going to introduce, of course, the concept of private property. But this very early time, what we see is a kind of what is called primitive communism, in which there is no private property and there is no private ownership of things, in other words. This idea that individuals have the right to own something and they're the owners of that is valuable, a resource, for example, or certain kinds of, like wealth, for example, of any kind. This is absent during this time. So that's what communism is. Again, this is really the absence of private ownership of resources and wealth, and everything is shared in common. In other words, everything that the group produces is owned by the group. That's what really communism is. So the plants, the edible plants that women collect, and the fish and the wild game that men hunt is owned in common. This idea that, well, this fish is mine because, I put an effort as an individual to actually collect it, and I went into the lake, and, it was very time consuming, so this is only something that I'm going to eat by myself. No, during this time, everything that the members of the band collected was owned in common. So this is what is called primitive communism. And it's kind of understandable because, again, there's nothing that people can actually accumulate and store. I mean, if bands are moving from place to place, how much can you actually carry with you from place to place? There's really not a whole lot that people are carrying with them, like private possessions, for example. Okay? So you have to be very mobile. You have to just carry the essentials like weapons, perhaps some animal skins, and that's about it. This is what you're carrying. If you are to survive, you have to be very, very fit, very light, in terms of your, the kind of weight of, that you're carrying along with you. So people are not really owning much in this case. So it's kind of understandable that when people cannot really store and carry with them their possessions, obviously private property is not going to be something that will arise. Now, we might ask ourselves, for example, why is it that people had to share their food? If I killed, for example, a deer, why would I take this deer and say to the members of the band, okay, let's go all have a feast on this? Okay, obviously I have to share this deer, even though I myself and only me killed this deer. No one else helped me. So there's a reason for that, and the reason has to do also with the future. Even though, people are not necessarily thinking in terms of the future, in terms of next week or next month or next year, of course, as we'll see. What people during this time were trying to do is store food, for example, the way we, for example, today save money. Whenever, we earn money, we try to save some for the future. Because maybe in the future I'm going to need this money, so I'm going to actually set some money aside and so on in the bank, etc. It doesn't matter. And this money will be useful in the future later on. Well, back then, there's absolutely no way you can actually store anything. As I mentioned, even the meat of this deer is going to rot rather quickly. I mean, it has to be eaten right away. So there's no way that people during this time were able to preserve the food and actually maintain it for the future. So the way they were trying to store this food is by sharing it and storing it in the organisms in the stomach of other people. Okay? Because by doing so, what they were doing is that they were kind of saving something for the future. It was like an investment. Look, I killed this deer, but I'm sharing it with you all. I'm sharing the meat with the expectation that this is going to be a reciprocal relationship. In other words, that in the future, whenever somebody else kills a deer, they're going to actually share that meat with me because we're actually returning, if you will, something from one another. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's a give and take, in other words. And that maintained the integrity, if you will, of the band. So it's very important why those ideas emerge very early on. It's called primitive communism, in other words. So there's the absence of ownership. Everybody shares their product with everybody else, and so on, for the reasons I just explained. Now, the culture of the Paleolithic era also involved the creation of a religious worldview. Meaning that very early human societies, early humans during this time, were not only crafting tools for their survival, they were not only coming together to form the very first kind of society, the band, which really, if you think about it, this was really the very early origin of the family, the band, if you will. As I mentioned, it was really the very first family. It was an extended family. And what remains today of the family is really the continuity, the survival, a carryover from this very, very early concept, if you will, a band. So early human beings were not only crafting tools, and they were crafting the very first social unit, like a family or a band. They were also crafting ideas about the world around them. They were trying to cope. They were trying to understand the world of nature. What is the world of nature? How it works? Who's in charge? If there's anybody in charge. Because it was a very mysterious and magical place for those very early humans. They were amazed by the forces of nature, by rain, by thunder, lightning, for example. They were marveled by them, but also they were terrified also by those forces. They witnessed volcanic eruptions, which were also quite terrifying as well, earthquakes, all kinds of natural catastrophes, and of course the concept of death, the end of life as well. So human beings were fascinated about this magical world that they lived in. They were also terrified, and they had a lot of questions that they tried to answer, and they did answer in a way that we're going to see by answering those questions about the meaning of existence, how nature came about, what are the forces of nature, how this all works. Eventually, those answers are going to become the very first religion in world history. We're going to see the emergence of a religious worldview very early on in the Old Stone Age. And if you study the history of world religions, you'll learn that the very first religion that ever existed in the world, it was a religion called animism. And this was the religion of all human beings around the world. It did not matter where they were. Whether we're talking about Africa or we're talking about the human beings that stepped out of Africa to populate Europe and Asia, the Middle East, the American continent, and so on. Very early on, the very first set of religious ideas were grouped together to form the very first religious worldview that today scholars call animism. What is animism? Animism is the belief that the world of nature, is moved and is animated by spirits, a multiplicity of spirits. That is what's called animism. That the world is animated, is alive, that the trees are alive, that the rocks are alive, the mountains, the creeks, for example, the rivers, the lakes, the clouds, the sky, and everything within the sky is alive, is a living thing. And it's alive because there's a spirit inside of them. Okay, that is what's called animism. Not everything is alive because everything has a spirit. So, animals have spirits, humans have spirits. This is the very early concept of what today we call the soul, for example. The religious idea that human beings have a soul, for example. Well, this goes back to this time when human beings really started formulating those ideas that, well, everything is alive. We are alive. We're alive because we have a spirit within ourselves. But not only human beings have a spirit, animals have a spirit. They're animated. They move about. They have a life. That's animation. Animation means that they have life, in other words. And that life is that there's a spirit inside of that animal that is animating and bringing that animal to life. The same holds true for plants. All kinds of plants also are animated. They're alive. There's no denying that they're alive. They grow, they blossom, they render fruit, and so on. Well, this is a life principle. And that life is a spirit that lives within those trees and plants and so on. But more than that, animism also conceives of even things that don't appear to be alive. For example, the moon. Does the moon really appear to be alive? Well, we can actually maybe imagine the moon as alive in that fashion. The sun, or even a mountain. When we look at a mountain, we might not think that is actually an organism, but early humans believed it was an organism and it was alive. Consider a volcanic eruption. That is some form of activity. There is activity, volcanic activity, and it seems that this mountain has taken a life of its own and is angry. So there must be a spirit inside of that mountain, and that spirit can become very, very mad and very angry, and they can spit fire and destroy everything around it, for example. So everything has life, even the moon, the sun, the stars, even the wind, water and so on. Everything was alive because everything moved, in other words. And if everything moves, that means that there's a spirit that is actually moving it. Whether it's water or wind or earth, doesn't matter, again. Let alone plants and animals and humans, they're constantly active, of course. So this is, again, called animism. This is the basis of all religions of the world. So even today, when we look at modern day religions, like the major religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, for example, Islam, and so on, they all have their roots in animism. Okay? This idea that there is a spirit realm, a spirit world, and that humans do have a spirit, and that is really the part of us that is the most real, and that after death, that spirit survives, for example. Now, every religion has a different take about what the spirit is and where it goes. But nonetheless, again, it's really something that goes back to animism. Now, during this time, as I mentioned a few moments ago, early humans did not conceive of time in terms of, for example, the past and the future. The way we do, we can actually look back and remember things way, way back. And of course, imagine also the future. The past, of course, is based on memory, and the future is based on imagination. During this time, human beings were not really concerned with those issues because they're so concerned with the here and the now, the present moment, and their survival. They're always preoccupied. They're always worried about survival. Now, they don't really have time to think about the future. It's not just that they don't have the time. It's just that it was so uncertain. Life was so uncertain that this idea that, well, I'm going to survive into old age. Maybe I'm going to survive next year and make a planning, etc. Life was just so uncertain that they knew that they could die any moment. So again, this idea that they could think way beyond the present day and formulate ideas, imagine, in other words, the future, again, was not really part of their experience. It's a ahistorical time, it's called. Human beings during this time also developed the very first religious paraphernalia, so to speak, the very first religious objects, such as totems, for example. In very general terms, what a totem is really a symbolic representation of a god. And during this time, human beings believed more often than not that animals were gods. They believed that animals were gods because they were the primary source of food, and food perpetuated life. So it's a simple equation. What keeps human beings alive? Food. Where food comes from, primarily animals. So animals must be gods because, again, since the beginning of time, God has always been referred to that which is the source of life, that which created life. We call it God. So during this time, the conclusion is, well, animals are really gods because they are providing life, food. And so the totem was really an object that represented an animal, and it was worshipped, again, as a god. And people believe that those totems actually contain the spirits also of the animals as well. They began to practice different kinds of rituals to actually move the spirit of an animal from the animal onto this object and spellbind it. In other words, it's a spellbinding ritual that involved animal sacrifice. You sacrifice the animal in order to create the statue, the totem, as it was called, of the animal, and then you are going to supercharge, again, this totem with the soul of the animal and keep it with you. It's called a totem. And that becomes the god of the band, the god of the people. And now people have the totem with them, and they're moving along with them, with the god, in other words. So who were performing those spellbinding rituals, those animal sacrifices and so on to create the totems, and who was actually keeping the god with them? Well, we're going to see the rise of the very first religious figures. They were called the shamans. Of course, this is a word that comes from Asia, northern Asia, from Siberia, the shamans. But all over the world, there were figures that performed the same functions. Those were peoples, again, that were crafting the totems. They were conducting the animal sacrifices, and they were empowering, endowing those objects with life, if you will, keeping, again, the god along with them. They were the mediators between the people and the god. They were the god keepers, if you will. They were also called magic workers because those objects, those totems that were considered magical artifacts, were also used for magical purposes, for hunting, for example. Oh, you're going to, embark on an expedition, for hunting. Well, you use the totem in order to help you, succeed in this expedition as well. So they were called magic workers. Even the spellbinding ritual of spellbinding the soul of the animal onto the object or the totem was called magic. Again, so they're the magic workers as well. So we're going to see very early on the rise, the emergence of the very first religious leaders who are performing the very first rituals, if you will, in world history. Now, one of the very important and prominent gods, as I mentioned, of the Old Stone Age, this is what human beings pray to, they consider them as gods, were animals. Again, so we're going to see an animal cult on the rise. The animals actually become the gods of the bands. Certain bands prefer certain animals, understandably, because certain animals were key in their survival. So depending what kind of animal species people hunted or followed and so on, they're going to become the totems. They're going to become the animal god, if you will, the protector of the people, of the band, if you will. And they're being worshipped as the creators of everything. Animals were considered to be indeed the actual creators, if you will, of humanity and the creators of the world. It's an animal cult. And of course, they performed the very first rituals for the animals because animals had to be hunted. They were still considered gods, by the way, but they had to be hunted because otherwise, how will people survive? So what people did was create a series of rituals and ceremonies called hunting rites. Those are the hunting ceremonies or hunting rituals that the shamans performed, the magic workers, in order to guarantee the success of the hunting expedition. So there will be dances, for example, there will be prayers, there will be chants, that they perform, summoning the soul of the animal to ask permission for the animal to be sacrificed. So again, this is the beginning of the concept of the sacrificial act of the god in order to create the world. So in order to create the world, there was a sacrifice. Very early on, what people are coming to terms and kind of understanding is that, the creation of the world happened through a sacrificial act. It was an animal that sacrificed itself to create the world, and it's really continuing that sacrificial act from time to time every time humans hunt animals. That initial sacrificial act is being repeated over and over again, so they had to render some form of worship to that moment. In other words, we are going to reenact the sacrificial act of the god so the band can survive, the people has to survive, and the only way is that we have to call the god for the god to actually sacrifice itself. Again, this kind of resonates with current, for example, ideas in our world today, with religious ideas, with, for example, the sacrifice of a god, for example, to save humanity, is present in certain religions of the world, like Christianity, for example. This very early idea or concept was present during this time. We're also going to see the very early beginnings of religious art, really the beginning of art in very general terms, but art was not just art for the sake of amusement and self-indulgence. Art was totally religious. Every time people actually painted, for example, something on the mural, let's say on the wall of a cave. Remember, they dwelled in caves. Every time human beings actually painted something that was artistic and crafty, by their standards, of course, was something religious. It was something ceremonial. It was a sacred symbol that depicted the gods. So more often than not, many of the paintings, many of the remains, again, of artistic expression left to us by early humans on caves are actually animals, of course, gigantic animals like bulls or bison, for example, and so on, that are depicted in such a out of proportion level, if you will, that it is very clear what meant for early humans is that this is indeed a divinity. It is a god, for example. So they're beginning to engage in art again, but is totally religious. Now we're going to see a transition towards the second part of the Stone Age. So the Neolithic Age began about 10,000 BC, give and take, and spanned more or less to the time of the flourishing of world civilizations. By 3000 BC, there are very well established now cities in the Middle East and Northeast India, again, that clearly shows that the Stone Age was coming to an end, and what we're going to see is a whole new age, the age of world civilizations, by 3000 BC. Now, around 10,000 BC, what we see is that human beings, after almost, again, 250,000 years of living in the natural environment, migrating from place to place, and trying to survive in very wide, diverse kinds of climatic settings and so on, developing tools, developing social organization of some kind, religious ideas, and so on, they're going to enter a whole new phase of food production. They're not going to be content with simply hunting and gathering anymore. Okay, this idea of just trying to collect food from the environment and just fish or hunt is not going to be sufficient. And they're going to initiate the very first food revolution in human history. And the very first the very first food revolution in human history marked the beginning of this new Stone Age called the Neolithic era, if you will. Okay. Human beings are trying to maximize food production now. So they started developing different tactics, different strategies for doing that. One was herding animals, for example. This is not just the activity of going out to hunt an animal, but rather you're trying to herd animals. In other words, they captured certain animals and they brought them to live with them, took care of them, and started breeding them. So by the time that they started breeding them, of course, the new offspring is going to be now totally accustomed, connected, at ease with the humans, the herders, again, that were tending them. They tended animals for the purpose of creating a food supply, of course. So we see the beginning of what's called herding, and also the herders. Again, people that were just herding different kinds of animals, of course. In the Middle East, of course, people are herding things like sheep, goats, for example. In other parts of the world, it was cattle. For example, in Africa, we see the very first cattle herders, for example, as well. And likewise, what we're going to be looking at is that human beings are beginning to domesticate different animal species, whether those were horses or hens or pigs and so on, over time. And they began to pretty much, again, create a new food supply. Early farming is also another strategy that was part of this first food revolution. Remember, this is a food revolution. People are beginning to increase the food supply. One was by herding, but also people are beginning, for the first time in human history, grow food from the land. Not just collected, but they had now accumulated enough knowledge to know what was the secret of the life of a plant. And that was, again, a seed. That the seed contained the future potential for creating a new plant. And it took human beings tens of thousands of years to come to that realization. So by 10,000, again, they're beginning to domesticate certain wild plants and create the very first gardens in world history. So this is the very early stage of farming, very, very early stages of farming. It was called horticulture. Horticulture is really gardening, in other words, creating the very first gardens in human history. So there is a transition. Again, the culture of the Stone Age people around the world is changing from being food gatherers to food producers. Again, they're now producing food in new, innovative ways. Again, like herding, for example, in early farming, creating the very, very first gardens in world history. Now, let us look at some of the new developments of the New Stone Age. And look at the new developments, the new tools, the new knowledge, the new technologies, and of course looking also at some of the changes that transpired during this time that could explain why there was also a transition into this new era of food production. Okay, so once again, herding animals was largely a necessity, if you will. If you were to feed more people, increase the food supply, you had to come into contact with the animal world and, of course, bring the animal world in close proximity with yours. And people will develop some form of relationship again with the animal kingdom, in that they learn a lot from the behavior of animals, how to feed them, how to graze them, how to move them from place to place, and they started really developing new knowledge, if you will, and new technologies. This is called nomadic pastoralism. Nomadic pastoralism, again, those are actually people that are nomads, but they're herding animals, they're moving animals from place to place, and they're going to develop a whole culture around this strategy of survival. There will be significant numbers of people around the world that will enter into this mode of knowledge, if you will. They will become herders. They're moving along certain lines, again, of water and food, grazing animals, and they're using those animals to survive, but also to trade them. To trade them for tools, to trade them for other kinds of food, as we'll see. Foods that were extracted from gardens and so on. Again, so this is called nomadic pastoralism. There's also the knowledge of the plant cycle, as I mentioned. This is a knowledge that was accumulated after tens of thousands of years, particularly by women. Now, women, remember, in the old Stone Age were the gatherers. They were responsible for going out into the wild and gather edible fruits, seeds, products, and so on from the fields. So women were more in contact with the plant kingdom. Men were more connected with the animal kingdom because they were the hunters, if you will. So they developed herding. But women were more connected with the vegetable or plant kingdom in this case. And so because they were more connected, they could observe plants, their behavior, how they were growing and sprouting, etc. So after thousands of years, they were able to discover, the secret for reproducing plants, which was really contained in a seed. And everything that came along with it was not just a seed you have to plant into the ground, is where to plant it, what kind of soil to use, what are the elements that help the plant grow, like water and sunshine, the seasons, what was the proper season for planting a seed, and so on. So this is the beginning of the very first scientific system of knowledge. It is knowledge that derives from understanding the plant cycle, if you will. Okay, so this is the very, very early origins of what today we call natural science. Natural elements and cyclical time. That is to say, women came to terms with, again, the natural elements, the heat of the sun, water, the earth, the soil, wind, oxygen, and so on, and the cycles of time, that plants were totally connected and tied within the cycles of time. When plants were sprouting and growing and also withering away and dying, they all had to and were connected to the four seasons. In the spring, summer, fall, and winter, that is the cycle of time. That is the cycle of the plant life, if you will. That is the plant cycle. Women also developed certain tools to create the very first gardens. They're called the digging stick and the stone hoe. Again, it's really simplistic. You get a stick, you dig a hole in the ground, you plant a seed, and then you step on it, for example. This is not large agricultural production. This is not even agriculture. Again, this is the state that preceded the stage of agriculture. It was called horticulture. Is again early farming or gardening. Okay? And also, there is something new on the rise, and that is seed collection, the collection of seeds. Women are also understanding that by collecting seeds, you're saving, if you will, something for the future. You're collecting seeds in order to have enough food supply for the future. You set them aside, you set the best plants, and you collect the seeds from those plants. You set them aside because you understand that those are the plants that are going to flourish. They're going to be replicated in the future. And so you're just kind of storing, again, food in seed form. Now, around 10,000 BC, what scientists are now understanding through the archaeological record by studying, of course, glaciers and studying earth formations and earth layers and so on, is that the reason why there was a transition towards horticulture, a new age, if you will, of food production, had to do with climate change. Apparently 10,000 years ago, we're going to see a kind of ice age affecting the planet. There was an ice age. An ice age that was so critical that it ended up killing the large animals species of the world. So the larger animals die off, meaning that the large animals were the ones that actually provided the most food for people. Okay, so we can say that the reason why the Old Stone Age kind of lasted that long, so to speak, is because there were large animals that people could hunt, and people were content with actually just surviving in the environment with, again, ingesting, eating the flesh of those beasts. There was plentiful, if you will. But as the food supply decreased through the Ice Age, then human beings were forced to shift their strategies of survival, learn new knowledge, or implement knowledge that they had accumulated into a new strategy. And this led them actually to experiment with gardening, what's called horticulture. In other words, well, we need to start growing our own food. We also need to start herding animals as well, keeping them, in a group and breeding them and grazing them, because again, this is a way that we're actually going to guarantee food for the future. Okay, so climate change and environmental change caused cultural and social change as well. So you can see very early on how human societies in many cases change according to the changes happening in nature. When nature changes, human societies change accordingly. Okay, so this is very important. No matter how advanced our technologies become, nature will always at some point overpower us, because those are changes that we cannot actually control, like an ice age, for example. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, again, this led to early farming practices, the domestication of wild plants. It's called horticulture. So we see the proliferation of gardens, particularly, again, starting in Africa. This is something that today is corroborated by the archaeological record. Horticulture started in Africa. This knowledge of gardening and starting to grow fruits and cereals, vegetables, and herbal medicine, this knowledge started out in Africa, and out of Africa, this knowledge got to be exported around the world. Okay? So this is, again, something that must be taken into account, because once we get to the rise of civilizations, yes, it's true. Of course, each civilization domesticated a certain plant, a certain grain, and they started to mass produce that grain, whether we're talking about wheat in the Middle East or northern China, or whether we're talking about rice in southern Asia, whether we're talking about, for example, corn and beans in the Americas. Yes, it's true. Each civilization domesticated different kinds of wild plants, and they started building a civilization upon the mass production of that crop. But the knowledge very early on of how to go about actually keeping a garden, this is the early stage of farming, actually came from Africa, from Northeast Africa. Okay, and then every civilization began to domesticate different plants in different parts of the world, eventually leading to the rise of cities, of course. Africa, as I mentioned, is the home, again, of horticulture. 10,000 BC, we see, for example, in Africa, sorghum, cotton, for example, sesame seeds, gourds, black-eyed peas, peanuts, and watermelons, again, being domesticated. And some of those seeds, because there was seed collection, got to be exported out of Africa, and they took root, if you will, in different different parts of the world. We also see the invention of pottery. Very early on, Africa was also the home of this new artwork. People are beginning to craft, from clay, for example, from certain elements, from mud and so on, different kinds of artwork. More often than not, where those were plates or certain bases and so on, to contain water, to save it, and so on. So this is the beginning of pottery. And of course, it also includes religious art. Pottery also included the crafting of different idols, if you will, or totems that were the actual gods of the people. In the Middle East, we're also going to see herding and horticulture on the rise. Africa, we can see that very early on, again, with the domestication of the grains that we just looked at and fruits. And in the Middle East, we're going to see the domestication, for example, of certain animals, goats and sheep, and also the domestication of barley and wheat, and the creation of the very first gardens, if you will, along the banks of rivers. Something we're going to be exploring in great detail in session 3 of this topic. The significance of the rivers of the world, the big rivers for the rise of civilizations. In Southeast Asia, people are domesticating chickens and also certain fruits and grains like yama, for example, bananas and rice. And those are going to be instrumental also for the rise of human societies, for the rise of villages, communities, eventually for the rise of large cities as well. Rice will become really the staple, again, of Southeast Asia. In Middle America, whether it's Mesoamerica or Middle America, we see the domestication of maize, what today we just commonly call corn, beans, and pumpkin. In South America, in what is termed the Andes, the indigenous societies domesticated potatoes. And they're also, again, going to use those staples, if you will, those plants, those wild plants or grains or fruits, in order to start building their societies, their more complex societies. So this is very, very important, how the transition towards food production is really bringing about social and cultural transformations among human beings. Their societies cannot remain the same as they were back in the old Stone Age. We're going to see the rise of villages, for example. This is very, very important. People are beginning to now settle. That's what a sedentary society is. Sedentary society is that people are no longer forced to remain in this nomadic existence, moving from place to place, because if you are to create a garden, well, you have to settle in an area that has water, good soil, good climate, and so on, to create that garden. So we see the rise of villages. So once again, we see alterations in human societies that are becoming more complex, because people are now settling, living together, and creating a community called a village. It's a permanent, again, settlement that has available land with fertile soil, sources of water, and of course wild game as well to supplement the diet. And human populations are growing now exponentially. Human populations are growing from, let's say, a single village, anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000 members. Those might not seem like a lot to us in our present civilization, but for human societies during this time, where we're talking about 2,000 or 20,000 members, that was an astronomical number of people living together in a large community or series of communities or villages. They're all related to one another. Remember, there's kinship connections. They still have those ties of family, if you will, and this is a large family, if you will. Along with this comes public architecture, They have to worship their gods. Every community has a god, and he has to be worshipped. So you need a shrine. You need a small temple where people can go and visit and actually pray to the god of the people, the god of the village. He is the overseer, the protector of the people. So he has to be paid homage in public ceremonies, if you will. So there is a change taking place. We see the development of language. When people come together and live in a community, what happens is that they develop language, because certain sounds will become associated with certain objects of nature, and they're going to become words. And people will use those sounds or those words continuously within the community and create a formal, structured language, that is to say. So it is only when people are coming together and forming a community or village that we're going to see the rise of languages. And languages, of course, originated in Africa due to the fact that this is where the very first horticultural practices, the very first early farming activities or horticultural activities, the gardens actually originated. And as you can see, languages spread out of Africa, and they're going to take different forms in different parts of the world, whether it is the Germanic languages of Europe or the Mandarin languages, for example, of Asia, or the Native American languages, of course, the indigenous language of the Americas, and so on. They're all, in a certain sense, offshoots of this original root language, if you will, that came out of Africa. So linguistics is extremely significant in tracing, if you will, the history, the evolution of human societies, because you see connections between different languages and dialects, and it seems that they find connections all the way to Africa in this way. We see also the emergence of social complexity, meaning that human societies are becoming more complex in that they're growing exponentially. This is no longer a band of people of 50 members or so, but rather those are large communities, large villages of 20,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 again. And the basis of those new societies will remain to be the family. This is what is called kinship. Kinship is an extended family. That's what kinship is. It's any society in which the members are related to one another through familial connections, either because you were born into the group, or you married into the group, you become part of this family, or you were adopted. But nonetheless, kinship or family ties continue to be the basis, again, of this new society, this very early new society. They are considered to be tribal societies, meaning this, that what we see is the emergence of what is called a tribe. Okay, what a tribe is a large extended family that encompasses about 20,000 members. So within this tribe, all members see themselves related to one another, and they also can trace their origins to common ancestors. That's what a tribe is, or a tribal society. That, again, is an extended family that grows exponentially to include 20,000 members or so, or even less than that, but that people see themselves connected in familial connections and sharing common origins as well. Common origins, common ancestors in this case. So society is becoming more and more complex. This is no longer a simple band. Now we're talking about a sedentary society. Is significantly large, but still the family forms the basis of society. This is very important. The basis of human societies up to this time that we're actually discussing, from 10,000 BC all the way to 3,000 BC, all over the world, the universal principle, without exception, is that all people living together, whether it was a band of people moving from place to place, hunting, or the people that actually moved into this new stage of horticulture, living in villages and communities sustained by gardening. The basis of human societies was the family. People considered that their group, whether the band or the village, was a family. Okay, that they are living inside of an extended family, that is to say. So continuously, again, we see the continuity of this very, very old, very primordial concept that developed in the old Stone Age. It's called kinship. This is a universal principle governing all early human societies, and of course, there's been considerable change that has happened ever since. With the rise of civilizations, as we'll see, this kinship principle, this idea that you live together with people that are part of your family, is going to be broken, as we'll see in the city. Once people enter the city, not everybody living in the city was an extended family. Not everybody was connected to you in this familial connection. In many of the civilizations, with very few exceptions, the idea was that people living in a city were people that came from many backgrounds, and they were considered to be strangers, in other words. Okay, with very few exceptions. The exceptions were China, for example, the Native Americans, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Maya, for example. They continued to live in cities, but the members of the city were considered their families. But without those examples, set aside, for example, Chinese civilization or Mesoamerican civilizations, all over the world, again, the idea is that once the city arises, this idea that family forms the basis of society is going to be broken up, in other words. Now, this is the end, again, of part 2. When we come back in part 3, we will continue to explore yet other elements of early human societies, for example, religious complexity. We're going to talk about political organization. And once we cover that, then part 3 is going to be devoted entirely to see the rise of civilizations. Okay, the rise of civilizations. How civilizations emerged, and what are the major themes and key concepts that we are going to study with the rise of civilizations. Okay, so this is the end of part 2. We will continue our discussion in session 3 of this topic, and I will provide an introduction once we begin that third session. This is all I have for you. Thank you.